What was the U.S. response to this then?
Well, the response was quite simple. This is when the Green Berets, who had originally been formed to parachute into Eastern Europe to organize guerrilla movements in Eastern Europe, got reformulated as counterinsurgency experts, and they were sent to Vietnam by President Kennedy in 1960. There was also a massive increase in CIA operations. The whole idea of covert warfare, remember, in counterinsurgency warfare, remember we had failed at the Bay of Pigs in 1961? Mm-hmm. And so the idea was that we must become experts at fighting these wars of national liberation, and that we must have new warrior technicians who could intervene in underdeveloped countries and fix things. And the Green Berets were one branch as fix-it men, CIA operatives were another, various logistics people, economists were others. Mm-hmm. We should remember, let's understand the class structure of Vietnam. It's a poor rural society. Most of the people are landless peasants or own very small plots of land. They're under subsistence agriculture, where a large part of their crop goes to the landlord. A small landowning class, most peasants are Buddhist with practiced elements of Confucianism as well. A small landowning class, many of them refugees from the north, many of them Catholic, controls the nation's wealth. So Diem and the government, Diem uses then the army as a mechanism to collect rents. And during the first war against the French, the Viet Cong had redistributed the land to the peasantry. So when Diem came to power in '54 with the army and acted as agents of the landlord to collect years of back rent, essentially the internal class polarization increased one more time.
And drove people of the Viet Cong into revolutionary perspective.
Exactly.
And then Diem had to use more and more repression as a result of the dissatisfaction of the...
And the repression in turn meant that in essence that the Viet Cong or communist forces felt like they had to resort to armed struggle again.
So this is why you made your statement in your book that Diem had an army, but he was not a government.
That's right. No, there was no effective administration other than military administration. Diem eventually replaced all forms of village council, all forms of intermediary powers that had any linkage to below were destroyed. Instead, all loyalty was from the top down.
Yet the American escalation didn't really dramatically accelerate until after Diem's assassination. What brought about this dramatic acceleration and what you call techno-war to Vietnam?
When Diem was gone, all the other Vietnamese generals began a power struggle among themselves. Consequently, whatever government repressive apparatus Diem had collapsed. Desertions increased radically. Defections to Viet Cong units became stronger and stronger. By '64, American policymakers feared that there would be a provisional revolutionary government, an open provisional revolutionary government in much of the countryside, which we had lost. Mm-hmm. Remember, let's get straight. U.S. forces lost, or the French lost in '45. We lost again in '54. We lost again in '63, '64. We escalate. The United States escalates in the face of defeat, mm-hmm. not in the face of victory.
Right.
So, massive defeat in '63 and '64 brought in then the need for U.S. ground troops and sustained bombing of the North in order to try to salvage the situation.
Why couldn't the U.S. accept a defeat in this small corner of the world?
The United States has been unwilling to deal with communism as a political, social, and economic movement. Instead, it gets seen that we as Americans are the natural beings of the world, and that capitalism is the natural economic order, and that our system is simply the essence of human goodness and the essence of nature. Therefore, something very, very different from us is not another society with whom one compares differences and makes treaties with and so on and so forth, but instead is an alien presence. If we're nature, they're anti-nature, or what I call the foreign other. During World War II, the Soviet Union did take over, right after World War II, did invade and take over Eastern Europe. The Red Army did, and you had to hold it as a buffer zone, and they did install puppet dictatorships there. This became the model for all American views of communist and socialist of any kind. Americans did not understand internal revolution. They did not understand the Chinese Revolution in the 40s that there were like millions upon millions of poor peasants who wanted land to survive, and that Mao Zedong and the Communist Party offered them land and survival, whereas Chiang Kai-shek was a warlord who offered them nothing. So, unable to see internal struggles for socialism or communism, or unable to see even internal struggles for national independence against colonialism,
right.
The world gets divided into them and us. Mm-hmm. And we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. They are the foreign other. They're trying to move in. So all forms of communism movements get seen in that light. So in this sense, then, any particular movement in the world is not just a particular movement in a dirt-poor country. And let's remember how dirt-poor Vietnam is then. And we had very little investment there. Instead, any movement is a sign of the global movement. A victory, a few poor peasants win in Vietnam. That doesn't mean just that that a little few more people have a few more rights. Instead, that means that the foreign other, the monolithic machine, has encroached one more step, and that with each other step, the rest of the world becomes imperiled. This, of course, is the domino theory. So like a contagious disease, sort of, instead of like each country having its own history and its own culture and its own people. It's as if the world is an empty shell, like a chessboard, and it's either our side or their side, and once they get going, just somehow a mechanistic momentum will propel communism to victory. It's a very, I call it mechanistic anti-communism, because it's a mechanistic framework of the world, and the enemy is foreign other. They aren't really real enemy at all. It's an abstraction.
So isn't that also, aren't there two sides of this? The other side is the people, the big decision makers, the foreign policy establishment, as you term it, looking at the world on a more realistic basis. As General Maxwell Taylor said in his book, we have to keep an iron grip on the third world country because they're poor and they want riches, and the riches would have to come from us. So they look at any type of victory, such as in Vietnam, as providing an example to other third world countries, that if they can do it and get away with it in Vietnam, they can get away with it in other countries.
So it's a universal sign. The victory in Vietnam was a universal sign of national liberation victory everywhere. A defeat in Vietnam means that all liberation movements will give up their struggles.
So, Bill, given the fact of this military-industrial complex in the United States that had built up a new military machine and model of warfare, given the mechanistic anti-communism that was motivating the foreign policy decisions of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and given the collapse of the Diem South Vietnamese government in Vietnam, it was almost inevitable that U.S. involvement would intensify, that this war was not an accident, that this war was not just a policy mistake, but it was a consequence, basically, of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. industrial and military development since World War II, that this was the test case. This is where they had to test their war machine and stop communism.
I really want to stress together that one of the principal arguments I'm trying to critique in my book is this notion that we just made one mistake after another, that nobody was really responsible for anything, that things just sort of slipped up. You don't go to war that way. You go to war far, far in advance. In '64, when Johnson was making announcements about the Gulf of Tonkin and just sort of like how it was a surprise attack, which it wasn't, and in early '65, when they were making announcements to the American public that maybe we'd send a few thousand more troops to Vietnam, they fully expected to send 200,000 people by the end of '65, another 100,000 by '66, and another 100,000 by '67. The estimates were already there that it'd take 500,000 men.
So it was a
planned-out war. This was a planned warfare, a planned escalation.